Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for today's event, COP26 Race to Zero webinar series, Scenarios for TCFD-aligned Disclosure. This event has been organized by the Hong Kong Institute of Certified Public Accountants and is supported by Civic Exchange, the British Consulate General of Hong Kong, Hong Kong Green Finance Association, the Business Environment Council, HKUST Institute for the Environment, and the Division of Environment and Sustainability. My name is James Robertson, Head of Asia, ex-China, and Japan at the UN-supported Principles for Responsible Investment, or PRI, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. As many of you joining us today will know, in 2015, the G20 mandated Financial Stability Board set up TCFD to advise how to handle the systemic risk to the global financial system caused by climate change impacting company values. Hong Kong's regulators, alongside many others around the world, and as part of the Hong Kong's green and sustainable finance strategy, plan to make TCFD reporting mandatory for relevant sectors no later than 2025. As part of this requirement, companies will need to report how they will fare under different scenarios, 10 or more years in the future, and this forward-looking exercise will need years to help develop the scenario planning needed and to coordinate with auditors and others to advise on how such reporting would be assured. In today's webinar, we are delighted to be joined by three particularly knowledgeable speakers. Lois Guthrie, Director, Redefining Value at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Frank Lung, Head, Banking Policy at the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. And Hendrik Rosenfeld, Director of Group Sustainability at CLP. In our program, we will begin with a presentation from Lois on the work of WBCSD with regards to TCFD, followed by background from Frank at HKMA on the recently launched pilot stress testing exercise on climate for banks, and hearing from CLP Sustainability Director Hendrik on their TCFD experience and journey so far. This will be followed by a panel discussion with audience Q&A, and we encourage you to provide as many questions as you would like. We will try and address these during our discussion. Before I welcome and introduce our first speaker, I would like to add a brief comment from the investor perspective. The PRI is an investor initiative with over 4,000 institutional investor members managing over 100 trillion US in assets under management. And for our members, climate change is the highest priority ESG issue facing investors. They're looking to protect portfolios from risks and to better understand and capture opportunities in the inevitable shift to a low carbon economy. So climate change is a systemic issue. It affects all asset types and all sectors, and as such, it will impact the portfolio returns, the asset valuations, and the asset allocation processes of investors. It will provide new investment opportunities and also new risks. And investors themselves are already facing pressure to align with TCFD. For example, PRI signatories have been required to report to the organization on several indicators regarding the management of risks and opportunities related to climate change since 2020. And some of the world's largest companies are already facing increased pressure from investors through climate-related resolutions, individual or collaborative engagement. One example, the Climate Action 100 Plus targets the world's largest corporate greenhouse gas emitters to take stronger and necessary action on climate change. And institutional investors are already making their own pledges towards net zero by 2050. As part of this, they all need data, and that is what TCFD is about. So this is not only a regulatory-driven trend or movement, this is important for investors as well. Now, our first speaker, I'm delighted to introduce Ms. Lois Guthrie, Director, Redefining Value at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Lois initially pursued a career in taxation, first at PwC and then at Zurich Insurance until 2016. But at the same time, having joined the Carbon Disclosure Project, or CDP, in 2004, she was simultaneously developing a career in climate and natural capital resources and reporting. She has held roles as executive director at the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, has spent 2 years seconded to the International Integrated Reporting Council, IIRC, helping the development of the IR framework, and in her current role as director at the WBCSD is focusing on the Redefining Value program. WBCSD have been facilitating a number of projects at the TCFD's request, focused around 3 areas: facilitating preparer forums, contributing to specific guidance issued by the TCFD itself, and they are currently focused on climate reference scenarios for the energy project. So I'm delighted to be joined by Lois to learn more about this work, as well as the TCFD recommendations themselves. Lois, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, James, and thank you so much to the organisers for inviting me to speak today on behalf of WBCSD. As you know, we're talking today about scenarios for TCFD-aligned disclosures. I'll just check I can move my slides here. Yes, I think so, yes. So today I'm just going to run through a bit about the TCFD's background and status, focus on what WBCSD is doing to work with companies on scenario analysis and how they use that for assessing strategic resilience. And I'll say a little bit about what's on the horizon in terms of developing activities. So today I just want to give you an overview really of the current situation with some information about the challenges companies face, some practical and process tips you can use, and what to expect for the future. So I think you all know, by the way, that WBCSD is a CEO-led organisation with 200 companies, and those companies work together to accelerate the transition to a more sustainable world by making sustainable companies more successful. So back to TCFD. Well, as you know, TCFD was established in 2015 and its recommendations were published in 2017, as James said, to allow stakeholders in the financial system to understand exposure to climate-related risk. Now, the TCFD has been very successful, I think partly because of its sponsorship and its monitoring by the Financial Stability Board and support from the G7, G20 and others. So you'll see from these headlines that the TCFD now has 2,138 supporters, controlling a great deal of market capital. And there are many financial firms, 961, that also support the TCFD across 78 countries. The little key takeaways and findings you see on the right-hand side of the screen there are from the TCFD's status report. They issue this annually to tell people about the status of their work. And you'll see that nearly 60% of the world's largest public companies are supporting the TCFD and reporting in line with their recommendations. And the penultimate bullet there, expert users find the impact of climate change on a company's business and strategy as the most useful for decision making. And this includes the long-term impact assessed using scenario analysis as a tool. So I'm sure you're all very familiar with the TCFD disclosure recommendations that are structured in 4 categories, asking companies about the way in which they govern climate change risks and opportunities, what their strategy is for dealing with them, how they manage the associated risks, and how they measure and monitor metrics associated with climate-related risks and opportunities. The recommendation about scenario analysis is circled in green here, Under the strategy recommendation, companies are asked to describe the resilience of their strategy, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios, including a 2-degree or lower scenario. So that's where the scenario analysis recommendation lives. Now, the TCFD issued guidance when they first launched their recommendations in 2017. So there was the final report setting out their recommendations together with implementation guidance and a technical supplement on the scenario analysis. Now, the implementation guidance sort of separates guidance for what we call the real economy, and particularly companies in energy, transport, materials and buildings, agriculture, food and forest products, so the big emitters, those with the most impact, from the guidance for financial institutions. Now, the guidance on scenario analysis has recently been updated. If you haven't seen this very recent guidance from the TCFD and you are looking to start or develop your scenario analysis practice, this is well worth looking at. It's quite long guidance, but there are lots of neat summaries about developing practical and process-oriented ways for non-financial companies to use climate-related scenario analysis. So it really takes you through a process that you can use and addresses some of the challenges of disclosure about strategic resilience based on scenario analysis. Now, why did the TCFD do this? Well, in their 2020 status report, they had noted that there is that the quality and quantity of disclosure on the resilience and scenario analysis recommendation was a lot poorer than in relation to other recommendations. So you can see that as at 2019, only 7% of companies that were analysed for the survey were responding to the strategic resilience recommendation. And similarly, there were fairly poor statistics in relation to the recommendation on integrating climate change into overall risk management guidance. Now, the TCFD's findings, they really match with what we've found in our work with companies at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So in particular, we find that companies are wondering, well, we know we are meant to make a disclosure about the resilience of our strategy, but what measures do we use to do that? What is evidence of strategic and operational resilience? Is it to do with the fact that we have adaptive capacity, that we're flexible in terms of our skills and competencies, that we could transform our business model if we need to, that we are developing new products and assets so our portfolio is developing in response to climate change? On scenario analysis itself, what is the process we should use? What are acceptable and legitimate assumptions? What parameters should we be following, conditions and inputs? And what timeframes should our scenario analysis be conducted over? So the TCFD's list of challenges in their status report really matched ours at the World Business Council. And these things amount to two things, really. Because scenario analysis describes an outcome in the future at a particular time horizon and a pathway from today to that future, of course, there's a great deal of uncertainty involved. As I said at the top there, the IPCC defined that as a cognitive state of incomplete knowledge that results from lack of information and or disagreement about what is known or knowable. And I think this is a typical sort of statement related to scenarios. It's so uncertain. Secondly, there's the complexity involved. There's an extract that I've taken from a specialist report here that shows that, for example, there are 90 1.5 or 1.5 consistent type scenarios in the public domain. So the question for companies then is, how do I choose a scenario? How do I interpret and navigate existing public climate scenarios for assessing my corporate strategy's resilience? And how do I balance the type of analysis I might want to conduct in my company because it will provide me with business relevant information? How do I balance that with the needs of users of climate related financial information, existing and potential investors? And also, because many climate scenarios are actually aggregated high-level representations of energy economy interactions, they lack specific quantification of scenario impacts at company level. And many of the scenarios in the public domain were not designed to be used by companies for generating business relevant metrics. So that there are some challenges associated there. But where we have a lot of challenges, I always think the best thing to do is let's try and focus on what we do know. We know that there is alignment on ambition and science, and that alignment is coalescing around the fact that we need to try to limit temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. And indeed, you'll see in the new TCFD guidance that I pointed out earlier, that although the TCFD recommendation talks about using scenarios that aim for 2 degree or lower outcomes, actually the narrative is changing quite a lot to focus more on the 1.5 degree type scenarios. So we know that there's a great policy support for this, and in the IEA's recent report, they tell us that 44 countries plus the EU have pledged to meet a net zero emissions target. And those pledges account for 70% of global CO2 emissions and GDP. Many of these pledges are legal obligations, some are proposed legal obligations, and others are in official documents. So you see the trend. James talked about the investor expectations, and that although there are a lot of investor initiatives out there, the general trend is that they focus on seeking to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and the Climate Action 100 initiative that James mentioned is a good start for understanding what the investors' expectations are. In addition, we have a new work on what a 1.5 or net zero world could look like, and you'll see the front cover of the IEA's new report on the right-hand side of the screen there, that sets out quite a very detailed roadmap for reaching 1.5. So that gives us more certainty about what the future could hold. And of course, what else as a company we know our strategy and we know our risks and opportunities because we're tracking them. And finally, in the category of what do we know, there are lots of resources out there. I've just mentioned 2 here, but the TCFD Knowledge Hub hosted by CDSB has lots of examples about how companies are tackling the TCFD recommendations. And if you want to know about climate scenarios itself, the IIASA has a great toolkit and learning center for people that want to know more about scenarios. Also, I won't go through this in detail, James mentioned it earlier. All these signals from policymakers, standard setters, governments, and international institutions around the world tell us about the support for climate action, about the support for goals, and in particular, about the support for the TCFD recommendations to be made mandatory in many jurisdictions and supported by standards such as those being developed by the International Financial Reporting frameworks. So I mentioned earlier, what do we know? We know that we need to focus on risks and opportunities. And here is an extract from the TCFD's guidance where they actually categorize the types of climate risks and opportunities that companies might encounter. And important to say here that in our work with companies, many have focused on leveraging opportunity and what sorts of opportunities the low carbon transition offers to their business model, their consumers, their product portfolio, as a way of responding to climate risks. And scenario analysis can also help understand where those opportunities can be maximized. Talking about the risk and opportunity, I mean, the scenario analysis guidance from the TCFD also says, that risk analysis can be used for helping you with your scenario analysis. So you look at the current situation. What risks do I face today? Is there anything being underestimated in our strategy and ambitions? So you can look back to previous trends and cycles, and this also helps you to sort of get a view of what might be needed from the company to fulfill its ambition and mission, in the sense when you look at the climate-related risks. What emerging trends and signals need to be followed? This is very relevant to scenario analysis. And what could be the implications for your business, for example, from an increasing global temperature and a low carbon economy, and when might those occur? So just quickly, the TCFD has also issued new guidance on risk management, integration and disclosure that might help companies with thinking about their climate-related risks. This is also on the TCFD website and is worth looking at, because understanding the risks and opportunities is really the first step in addressing scenario analysis and thinking about future risks. The final thing to mention in this particular section is that in the TCFD's new guidance on scenario analysis, they actually set out the process on one page. So they have here a series of 6 steps that companies can follow, and this sets out, in process terms, what companies can think about doing if they're at the start of their scenario analysis journey, or if they are thinking of developing it. So there's lots of helpful stuff in there. Now, I just want to talk about what we've been doing at WBCSD. As James mentioned, we have been coordinating preparer forums for 6 industries: oil and gas, electric utilities, chemicals, construction and building, food, agriculture and forest products, and autos. So the little thumbnails you see on the right of the screen are the front covers of the reports we've produced. And I think what might be of most interest to most companies is that within these reports, each has an average of about 40 examples of how leading companies are responding to the TCFD recommendations, including how they integrate climate into their risk management processes, how they evidence their strategic response and their resilience, how they are approaching scenario analysis, what particular concerns they have about understanding their own activity in the context of the value chain. You get specific sectoral insights in these reports, and each report sets out a table of climate-related metrics that can be used for each of these sectors. So I urge you to look at that. They're all worth mentioning, but I just wanted to mention some work of the food, agriculture and forest products sector, because they did something specific on looking at scenario analysis parameters, which I'll show you on the next page. On the right-hand side, you'll see that they look at what are the low carbon transition attributes that we need to consider and monitor as part of our assessment of strategic resilience. So they've categorized the variables concerned and they show their attributes. So for example, in the case of technology, for example, what efficiencies can they deploy? What operational and material deficiencies can they employ? On the social side, how might productivity be affected? And this is certainly an issue for some of our companies. So in looking at these variables and attributes, the companies have also, as well as thinking about how their resilience is affected, they're thinking about where do opportunities lie in this assessment. How will this affect our financial plans? Will we put more expenditure and capex into certain activity? How will we track development of sales from certain low carbon products, for example? The Food and Agriculture and Forest Product Preparer Forum also prepared this model of business resilience that I think, although it's specific to them, there are some lessons here for the other industries we've worked with, in that they recognize this cycle between the types of shocks and stresses they need to follow in terms of biophysical, socioeconomic, and climate, and how those, if they might be manifest over time and space. So will it affect their harvests and their products and their reputation? What will their response be in terms of mitigation, integration, adaptation, and innovation? What new practices might they need to put into place to transform their business model? So this is the Food, Agriculture, and Forest Product model of resilience that helped them to sort of contextualize why they were doing scenario analysis and how they would use it in their assessment. Sorry about this very busy slide here, but I just want to mention that the Auto Preparer Forum was the last report we issued and the only report that was generated after the TCFD had issued their new guidance on scenario analysis. So the Auto Preparer report actually shows you how the 6 participating companies that are listed here put into practice that scenario analysis guidance. In summary, they tracked the 2 drivers of the future that would inform their scenario analysis, being the speed at which there would be price parity between combustion and full electric vehicles, and also the extent of government support for or incentives for electric vehicle adoption. They tracked these drivers through a kind of a mapping and impact exercise you see depicted on the right. And from that, they developed some 4 scenarios that they would use for analysis that set out the different extents and times at which the 2 main drivers would manifest. So if you want to see how companies have actually put the TCFD guidance into practice, the Auto Preparer Forum is a useful one to look at. We also did a project on the construction industry, and they were very focused on how scenario analysis might manifest across the value chain. And of course, one of the leading examples from Lend-Lease, you'll see in that report, gives a very detailed analysis of how they conducted their scenario work. So during the course of these projects, in each one, we did some interaction with investors to get their insights. And the way I would summarize them is to say that when investors are considering how a company has assessed its resilience and whether it's resilient, they look for evidence of diversification. Is there sufficient flexibility and scope for business model adaptation in response to future trends and opportunities associated with the low carbon economy? Is the company managing, governing itself in such a way that it can respond to those? What are the financial implications of the company's resilience strategy, if you like? What are they putting their money into in terms of CapEx and OpEx? What are they spending on for innovation? What products are they developing? They also look at how the company is positioned in terms of its assets for the future, what targets and progress it's setting, importantly, not just in the long term, but also in the short and medium term, and that it's got a strong governance framework that articulates senior management and board accountability and oversight of climate risk. So I'm not going to go into these in detail because I believe the slides may be circulated and you're certainly welcome to have them. But based on all of the work that we've done, we have come up with some tests of resilience and the sorts of things that you can consider disclosing to the TCFD recommendations. On the bottom part of the slide, you'd really want to show that your strategy is well positioned in terms of the assets and products, resources and opportunities you've identified. It's well positioned for resilience. It's well financed for resilience. The strategy has structural and managerial support. And climate is integrated into the company's thinking, planning and processes so that there aren't any blind spots. And so that supports capacity and flexibility to transform the business model if necessary. So this is my final slide. What's next? As James mentioned earlier, WBCSD is currently engaged in a project with energy companies, that is on the supply and demand side of energy, to try to develop some business relevant reference scenarios that will provide a starting point for companies operating in the energy system to conduct a scenario analysis. It's meant to be a consistent reference point, and the work is really equivalent to or equates as far as possible with the reference scenario development work being conducted by NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, UNEP FI and PRI. So we've convened companies from across oil and gas, electric utilities, including Hendrix companies, CLP, transport, the built environment and industry, and we're working with technical specialists on this project to support the COP26 private finance priority that companies should assess the resilience of their strategy to climate risk. So I will finish there and thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that, Lois. It's really insightful to hear all of the great work that WBCSD has been doing. And obviously, Lois will be staying with us to answer both my follow-up questions and any we have from the audience. So please do start sending in your questions. Now, I'm also delighted to be joined by Frank Lung and Hendrik Rosenthal, our two panelists. Maybe, Frank, I can come to you first, and for our audience, a brief introduction. Frank is head of banking policy at the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and has been working with HKMA over the last 20 years with a focus on economic research. In his current role, he's responsible for policy formulation on, among others, liquidity requirements, green and sustainable banking, IRB approach to credit risk and exposure limits. And before his current role, he served as head of economic research at HKMA. Now, Frank, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority has really been strengthening their focus on climate-related risks. Last July, he issued a circular entitled Range of Practices for Management of Climate Risks. And in late December, began outreach to invite banks to participate in a pilot exercise on climate risk stress testing to be undertaken later this year. So can you tell us a little bit around the decision to launch this, the experience so far, and any lessons learned?
Okay, thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I think let me start with the TCFD disclosure requirement. If you ask business about how they see disclosure requirements, I think a common view is that it's just a compliance exercise, or even worse, just a tick box exercise. So I think this is somewhat understandable because even us regulators emphasize the role of disclosure as a pillar 3 measures to impose market disciplines on companies so that different stakeholders can assess the financial performance of corporates. I think that this line of thinking for the corporate itself could be somewhat self-limiting and may lead to a very risk aversion mindset. So instead, it may be more useful to think of it as a self-assessment process So through the disclosure requirement, that they can go through a process useful for their strategic planning, for engaging with the stakeholders, and also for their business decisions. So I hope that the listed companies and different financial institutions can see the requirement of the TCFD alignment by 2025 from this perspective, and use this as an opportunity to start the journey to assess how climate change would affect the business. And as you know, that among all the different aspects of the TCFD requirements, scenario analysis is often regarded as the most challenging aspect. And that's why the HKMA launched the pilot stress testing exercise to help banks gain experience and build the capability to assess their own climate resilience. So this webinar is about scenario analysis under the TCFD. Let me briefly talk about the scenario features in our HKMA pilot stress testing exercise. So for the scenario settings, we've developed the scenarios based on the NGFS and IPCC RCP scenarios and complement them with the projection of climate situation in Hong Kong. And meanwhile, we also allow banks to expand the scenario based on their own needs. I think that is where the works of the World Business Council will be useful. And I will touch on this point later on in the panel discussion. As for the types of climate risk to be tested, we test one physical risk scenario of a worsening climate situation in Hong Kong, and two transitional risk scenarios of orderly and disorderly transition to a low carbon emission economy. As for the types of exposure to be tested, we focus on mortgage or property related lendings, as well as the exposure to high carbon emission sectors. So for the progress of the banks so far, most of them are still in a preparation stage. Some of them have set up dedicated working groups within the banks to work on these issues. And we have also recently organized a closed-door discussion forums for banks to share their practices and to provide feedback. So going forward, we will maintain close dialogues with the banks to make sure that the progress is on track. And our plan is to ask them to submit the result to HKMA for review in the second half of this year. So a final point I want to say is that through the exercise, we find that doing climate risk related assessment is a long learning journey for all of us. If you ask the most advanced bank, they will even say that they still see a lot of room for improvement in the analysis. So no one is 100% ready for that. So I think the most important point is to start the journey and to gain experience. I think the same also applies for reporting well under the TCFD recommendations. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Frank. This really sounds like a very valuable exercise that HKMA is encouraging the banks to undertake. And I think we'd all be interested to hear at the end of this year more around that experience and the lessons learned. Now, I'd love to come on now to our second panelist, Hendrik. Again, some background for the audience. Hendrik is Director of Group Sustainability of CLP Group and is responsible for the group's sustainability-related strategy, reporting, and communications. He supports the senior management in sustainability and climate change-related risk management and advises on sustainability matters of the group's power business in the Asia-Pacific region. And Hendrik has over 20 years of experience in environmental management across the public, private, and NGO sectors, leading research and consulting projects in Canada, Hong Kong, Singapore, and other markets. So Hendrik, CLP Group has been one of the more visible and proactive companies in Hong Kong with regards to developing sustainability and climate-related strategies, and you've been including TCFD-aligned disclosures in your sustainability reports in recent years. Can you share a little bit more around CLP Group's TCFD journey, what that experience has been like to date, and any lessons learned?
Sure. Thanks very much for having me, and thank you for the very generous introduction as well. Climate change has been part of CLP's really sort of, we've been struggling and we've been dealing with this topic for quite some time. To be very frank and open, we've developed a climate vision as far back as 2007. And that climate vision was updated over the years. It included setting targets, it included setting a strategy, it had to have had the governance put around it in order for it to be driven forward within the organization. So when in 2017, TCFD came out with its report and its initial framework and the recommendations, we very much welcomed that development because it did provide that structure that we had already started building, but I think it did it even better in terms of specifying the various elements that come with what it means to apply and to respond to the recommendations of this framework. So the governance certainly being part of that. We have built certain levels of engagement with the senior management team on a regular basis by an executive committee. We have a board level sustainability committee where we deliberate on a regular basis several times a year our response to how we should manage our portfolio, how do we address physical impacts of climate, how is the organization ready to tackle this. The strategy element, that's really the climate vision that I mentioned already. We've updated it over the years. Back at the end of 2019, we just published our most recent version of that Climate Vision 2050, where we commit to an 80% reduction by 2050 in terms of carbon intensity. And we also commit to no longer invest in coal, to phase out coal by a certain year. And all these elements really sort of being very much specified in terms of what is it that the organization is doing to respond to climate change. The risk management element, that's really where it comes in, becomes quite interesting. And Lois had a slide earlier up as well in terms of how ESG is integrated into risk management with Corso and WBCFD, BCSD having provided guidance on that previously. And how is then climate change part and parcel of our risk register? And how is that then actually tracked and manifested on a regular basis in terms of who owns the various risks that come from climate, whether it's the portfolio, the assets themselves, and more sort of acute physical risks, but also the longer term risks that come with a changing climate. But at the same time, it's the whole change of regulatory backdrop, the energy transition coming through and really impacting the organization in terms of what is it that we need to do to change our business. Is it just about shutting down coal? Is it just about reducing our carbon intensity? Or is it a much bigger transition in terms of actually does the whole industry need to transition as well? And how do we track our progress in that? And that needs to be part of the risk register. It is a sort of approach that is much more longer term than a traditional risk register would be. Usually it's quite operational. 1, 2, depending on the industry, maybe 3 years out. That's what you track in your risk register. These are changes that are happening to the industry for the next 5, 10, 20 years. You need to be prepared. And you need to understand how to manage those risks and who in the organization is actually responding to that. And then, of course, the metrics and targets that, being very sort of almost basic, but not quite basic in the sense of, yeah, for us as an industry, we need to track our carbon intensity. We need to track how much renewables we have as part of a portfolio, how much are we reducing our carbon exposure. But at the same time, and I think this is really what came out through the Prepare forums that we worked together with Lois and her team as well, is how much are we earning from non-carbon? How much are we investing in non-carbon? This needs to be disclosed. Do we have a full spectrum of greenhouse gas emissions? Scope 1 and 2, yes. Scope 3, that needs to be part of the equation. And it's really pushing that forward in terms of tracking progress in that, but then even more so, are we also as an organization or as any electric utility working in this space, are we investing in the transition itself? Are we providing electric vehicle infrastructure, for instance? Are we supporting our customers to become more energy efficient, waste less? How do you track that performance? So that's the beauty of the TCFD. It allowed us to really put these 4 buckets in front of us and then be very specific. And with Prepare Forum, it was so useful for us to actually discuss that with other peers and then bring that out to the market in terms of what is good practice, what is best practice, where are some gaps in scenario analysis. We could talk about that as well, but certainly identified back then as well as a gap, and hence the reference scenario project that Lois is working on is so important.
Excellent. I mean, thanks. It's really interesting to see how this journey has obviously evolved, and for CLP started way before TCFD was obviously launched, and this was a real focus both for regulators and for investors. So that is really encouraging, and obviously sounds like you've had a lot of value in terms of engaging with groups like WBCSD and being part of these activities to look at developing and understanding good and best practice as well. Now, Lois, if I can come back to you, you finished your presentation highlighting new work around the development of climate reference scenarios. How do you see WBCSD's work helping to reduce some of the complexity around scenario analysis through this project?
Yeah, thanks, James. Just going back to something that Frank said about, the potential for TCFD to be used as a tick box exercise. Of course, that can happen, but in our experience, the companies use it as an internal tool mostly, and they find great value in the structure, as Hendrik described. But of course, these companies, they're running businesses, they're making cement and growing crops. They can't, by definition, devote this resource that would be required to understand how climate scenarios are built, the relative merits of different models. It's such a complex area. And what we seek to do is to say, the reference scenarios that will be developed by the group are there to give some confidence about the types of narratives that companies can use, simple narratives that align, with what Frank said about the NGFS type. So there'll be an orderly type of future, a disorderly type of future, with pathways that, perhaps think about technological advancement being more successful, others that depend on in policy cooperation. So the narratives will be simple and aligned as far as possible with those of financial regulators and institutions. The pathways will be clear, but the scenarios themselves, as far as we know at the moment, and this is all subject to the discussion with the forum, they are so focused on keeping this simple so that companies can have a useful way of responding to the TCFD and understanding their risks. So as part of that commitment to simplicity, at this stage, it is unlikely that we will develop anything new. We may fill some of the gaps that Hendrik just referred to, but the intention is to use those narratives that I described and explain how existing scenarios can be used to conduct analysis against those narratives. So that's our approach. And we hope that, there's no intention that the scenarios that we produce are to be treated as standards. That's not the point. It's not that everybody should share the same worldview, because that's not helpful for scenario analysis. It's just a reference point that at least helps with comparability and consistency, but does not prevent companies from developing their own scenarios or using public scenarios. It's one of a suite of scenario analysis activity that's designed for simplicity, comparability, and consistency, and some confidence.
Excellent. That's really interesting. I think something we'll all be staying tuned to see how this develops and what comes out of it. And as you say, really important that this does say as simple as possible in terms of being able to understand what is required and how to take those steps. Now, Frank, I can come back to you. You mentioned in your remarks, that the work of WBCSD would be useful for banks in terms of how they'll enrich their own climate-related scenario analysis and stress testing. So could you expand a little bit on that thought?
I think the case studies in the WBCSD Preparer Forum can provide some useful references for banks to understand the carbon profiles of the supply chain of different industries. And I just heard from Louis that they're also working on some industry-specific scenarios that can also provide a useful template to impose a sector-specific overlay in banks' scenario analysis and stress testing exercise. I think both are very useful to improve the quality of the risk assessment. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And Hendrik, I have a question for you. This is a little bit coming from my side, being working with investors. Obviously, you've mentioned this has been an ongoing journey for some time, and I'm really interested to hear how a dialogue or engagement with investors has changed. So what has that dialogue been like, and what impact you think has the launch of TCFD had on the dialogue and disclosures, that conversation you're having with your investors around climate risk?
Well, I think to sum it up, it's exploded. The dialogue, in a nutshell, it's really grown to such an extent that for a time, I think, and maybe in the mid, it's around 2015ish or so, trying to do roadshows or so on ESG was perhaps not so interesting, and there was perhaps limited uptake. But then with the launch of TCFD, I think the world has changed in the last 2 years as well, in terms of the interest that it has come from the investor side and what we've all gone through. Clearly, I mean, we are sitting here with a mask on. But anyways, the world has changed to such an extent that the interest from the investor side has come through in a way that we very much welcome. But we feel like we've been prepared for this for some time, which is fine, which is good. But in terms of the dialogue and the sophistication increasing, I think the important part to remember, and this is partly one of the really important outcomes, I think, from the prepare forums, and now going to the reference scenarios as well. What is it that the investors are actually wanting here? We are talking about disclosure, right? It's the Taskforce for climate-related financial disclosure. Yes, and we as a corporate have taken it on board, and it's really sort of a very useful framework for structuring our thinking in terms of how to tackle that problem. But what is it exactly that, in what format, and how do they then measure whether a company is performing well or not so well in terms of managing its climate risk? And I think there's still quite a few unanswered questions, and investors are coming to us with different questions on the same thing. So it is quite a task to keep up, whether that's from the treasury side also, or from the investor side. The financial sector has really taken this on board to a degree that I find fantastic. We are having this discussion here at the CPA Institute, no less. I think it's all very good and all in the right direction, but we need to do more work to help investors better understand as well how to measure corporate performance sector by sector, perhaps. And through that process, then maybe there can be some alignment in terms of how do we actually move forward with demonstrating resilience. And then when you take that from an investor perspective, how is my portfolio actually stacking up, right? Yeah, I have 20, 30 companies. I don't envy them, in terms of measuring resilience of each one of those investments. But how do you bring that together? And there's some level of simplicity often built in, understandably so, because of the complexity of covering such a broad portfolio. But oftentimes to us as an individual company, it feels like as if we're not even being heard. In terms of we're doing all these things, we know, we're well aware, but we didn't tick your box actually. And you haven't fully understood our entire management approach and our response to these issues. So it's no easy answers, but I think it's a very good step in the right direction.
That's really interesting to hear. And obviously, a lot more work needs to be done on the investor side in terms of aligning, so that it's making it a lot easier for you to have that dialogue. But obviously, I think it also reinforces the importance of having engagement and dialogue between companies and investors, so that it's not just disclosure, but it's being able to talk about that disclosure and give that context and understanding, which is so vital. Now, again, we just have a few more minutes where we really encourage you to send in your questions if you had anything you would like us to address to the panelists and to our speakers today. We have one I'd like to put out to all of our speakers, so whoever would like to jump in on this one. So this is really, does the panel agree that if similar companies use similar scenarios, their reports will be more comparable and hence more useful? And if so, who should specify the scenarios?
Lois should specify. Or answer the question.
Well, thank you for your confidence, Hendrik. But I think what we've learned from working with preparer forums is that we have, we've really done the hard work to look at what's possible and to get the investor insights that Hendrik's mentioned. But I think the answer to the question is yes and no. Sorry to answer it in that way, but of course consistency and comparability is important, but the reality is that the companies are all very different, and what we would want to avoid, I think, is sacrificing the reality of different business models, strategies, needs, products, etc., for a consistent approach. Having said that, provided that the consistent comparable approach is understood to be just for that purpose, just to give a kind of maybe an engagement breadcrumb trail, or it has to be interpreted as what it is, an exercise to aid comparability and consistency, rather than a business specific resilience assessment. Then I think there might be some merit in it, but I very much agree with what Hendrik said, that the outputs must align with what the investor wants. That's the key.
If our other panelists have anything to add on that point? No? Okay, no problem at all. So another question here coming in. To what extent should TCFD reporting be assured? And is there a risk that the difficulty of assuring, talking about the future will restrict disclosure?
In my mind, I think whether it's financial or non-financial disclosure, it should be assured, whether it's TCFD or not. If you're putting out information into the market in terms of how you are actually managing your ESG risk or your climate-related risk, or what your financial performance is, there should be no real reason why that is not reviewed by an external assurance body, especially when it's quantitative.
And I presume that is the approach that CLP is currently taking as well?
Absolutely, especially if you look at the key KPIs, the ones that we've been tracking for a number of years, where we feel very comfortable in terms of these are core. Yes, absolutely. We do have a vast suite of KPIs that are assured. It is more tricky when you get into sort of emerging, and this is what we call the transition enablers of how do you measure those and what is it that you actually need to measure. In terms of, in our industry, for instance, is it how much have we invested, or how much are we enabling EV charging, or how much are we allowing or enabling our customers to save energy? These are sort of emerging topics. They're not so straightforward for a utility to measure, but over time, this is a place we need to get to as well.
And I see, Lois, I saw you nodding along with some of that response. So Frank or Lois, I'm not sure if you would both agree with that or have any additional comments to add on that point.
Yes, it's not really my area, James, but my colleague at WBCSD has worked with the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board to develop some standards on assuring this type of information. So to me, it's a technical thing, provided that standards are there to conduct the assurance in a way that gives the user confidence, then yes, would be fully supportive.
Excellent, great. Well, thank you so much. Well, looking at our time, unfortunately, we may have to end our discussions there. Thank you, of course, to our organizers. I would like to, of course, thank all of our speakers today. So Lois on the line, Frank, Hendrik for joining us in person. Of course, to our event supporters that I referenced earlier. I won't go through the entire list again, but thank you to each of them for their support and involvement. And of course, to everyone who has joined us today, we really appreciate your time. The HKICPA will be posting a recording of this webinar, as well as sharing the webinar slides. So please stay tuned for that. And of course, we encourage you to share that with colleagues and friends as and where you feel it can be helpful. And a final note is that the next webinar in the Race to Zero webinar series will be on the IFRS Foundation's work to set up an international sustainability standards board with TCFD reporting as its first priority. Delighted to say that Mr. Ashley Alder, chairman of the SFC, will be joining as the keynote speaker, and this webinar will be taking place on the 5th of July, so please do mark your calendars, and you can go online to get more information about that activity. So again, thank you so much to our panelists, to our organizers, and for everyone joining today. We hope this has been a helpful and informative discussion. For myself, I have really learned a lot, so thank you again.
Thank you.